Hello and welcome to Citizens Forum. This is being filmed on Tuesday, October the 6th. Our guest in this segment is Yves Engler. Yves is the author of a book called Canada in Africa. He's a Canadian author and activist, and we're going to be talking about Canada's role in Africa and probably saying a lot of things that you're never going to see on television, read in the newspapers, or hear on the radio. So Yves, thank you very much. And we're going to start by talking about Libya, which is currently, I believe, called a failed state. It's a disaster area, and Canada's role.
Yeah, and the Harper government in 2011 had a Canadian general lead the NATO bombing campaign. There were Canadian fighter jets, 7 Canadian fighter jets that participated in the campaign, and Canadian naval vessels participated. And Canada's role in bombing in the war in Libya has contributed to a lot of the instability we see today, where the rise of Islamic State within Libya, jumping off point for refugees into Europe, destabilization not just of Libya but of much of the region, and Canada's war in Libya was in complete violation of international law. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970-1973 precluded foreign forces from being on the ground in Libya. A number of media reports talked about how Canadian special forces were on the ground in Libya. Canadian Waterloo-based drone company provided drones to the rebels in Libya, with a former Canadian military man that trained the rebels in the use of the drones. Complete violation of international law. The UN resolutions that called for an arms embargo of Libya. Canadian privately held security company Garda World was operating on the ground, supporting the rebels, again in contravention of the UN Security Council resolution, which explicitly talked about no foreign mercenaries in the country. So for his role in Libya alone, Stephen Harper should be brought to tribunal, should be be in the dock and face courts.
You mean as a war criminal? As
a war criminal, a violation of international law, but also it's a war that has led to significant destabilization of the area. Tens of thousands of people probably have died. There was a report about a week ago talked about more than half of Libyans have been directly impacted by violence over the past few years since the NATO war, and yet in this election campaign, try to find a comment by any of the major leaders about what happened in Libya. The foreign policy debate that happened a couple of weeks ago, as I understand, no mention of Canada's role in Libya, no mention of Canada's role in destabilizing that country, and the significant human toll it's had on Libyans and people in the region.
So this is the truth of what, not Canadians, because we didn't even know about it, but the war criminals who run this country, the corporations and their politician puppets, and they don't even tell us about it. There's nothing in the media about this. And you're right, we're in the middle of an election. The other parties won't talk about it. I mean, personally, I believe the other parties are also corporate controlled, if I can say that, and the media won't talk about it. I mean, Stephen Harper, that's a serious allegation that you're saying, that you could consider Stephen Harper to be a war criminal for what he's done. Yeah, and yet here we are in the middle of an election and nobody will mention that fact. It scares me. I mean, what they've done, because what they've done in Libya, they'll happily do in Canada when our time comes, whoever they are.
Yeah, I mean, the media's unwillingness to discuss the illegality of the war in Libya is a profound omission, and it's a sign of incredible bias. And yeah, certainly the media just excludes what's not, what wasn't serving Western geostrategic interests. So, for instance, during the Libya campaign, the African Union put forward a whole series of different peace proposals to deal with the conflict between the rebels and the Gaddafi regime, to the point where there was heads of state from African countries in the midst of the conflict that traveled to Libya to try to negotiate a peaceful solution. That was just ignored by Washington, by Ottawa, by London, and it was ignored so much that it didn't even appear in our newspapers. So the fact that the African Union was boycotting conferences that were being organized in London around Libya because they were so angry with their exclusion from, their peace proposals being excluded. It wasn't, part of the discussion. So the media on foreign policy, the media very much follows the state line, and almost all commentators are subservient to state and corporate power on foreign policy.
So that means that we never hear the truth in any of our corporate-owned media, CBC, CTV, the Toronto Globe and Mail, all the local newspapers and all the radio stations, all of which are owned by half a dozen corporations.
Yeah, I wouldn't say we never hear the truth, but I would say that what we hear very select pieces of the truth, and the overall picture is almost never fully presented.
So, can I suggest that what happened in Libya is exactly the same as what happened in Syria? It was the creation of a rebel force by the United States with possibly Canadian assistance. So they created a rebel terrorist army, basically, in Libya, and armed it, funded it, got it going, used it to attack the government, and then my recollection is NATO came in to support this rebel force. And now, before this, Libya was the most prosperous nation in Africa, and they've destroyed it completely.
There's no doubt that they've destroyed it completely. I wouldn't say that there were legitimate grievances against Gaddafi,
yeah.
right? So there was no doubt that the NATO forces armed the rebels in contravention of international law. There's no doubt that they, provided military cover, Canadian Special Forces, Canadian fighter jets bombing in support of the rebels.
Now this is against international law.
It's against their own Security Council resolutions. There's no doubt about it. They are the ones.
This is Canada.
This is Canada. They're the Canada. The U.S. is the ones who.
And this has led to the picture where all the media pretended to cry so much about the child found dead on the beach a few weeks ago, the Syrian child, but when we were causing it, the media was completely silent. That's their complicity. And then to pretend to cry when the results happen that they helped cause, it just shows where our country is at in the year 2015.
Yeah, they, as part of their destabilization of Gaddafi, they made put a bunch of attention on the supposed human rights violations taking place in the east of the country at the start of the conflict. And we've now have very in-depth reports from Amnesty International showing that those are complete exaggerations. There was violence, and there were people that were killed, but the accusations of significant slaughter was just basically totally manufactured. But no, the basic rule is that when it's our enemies that are responsible for human rights violations, you get lots of media attention. When it's the human rights violations that we're responsible for, the media basically ignores them or suppresses any sort of significant moral outrage around them. In the case of Libya and many other cases, fit that pattern.
And here we are, as you said, in the middle of an election, and this is like an election with very little truth ever being spoken anywhere about what's going on. You wanted to talk a little bit about mining, Canada's role in Africa that way.
Yeah, the Harper government's basically made Canadian foreign policy in most African countries synonymous with the mining interests, mining companies. Canada is the mining superpower across the continent. There's 30 billion plus in Canadian mining investment. Canadian companies dominate mining in almost every African country outside of South Africa. And the Harper government has aggressively backed Canadian mining companies, him personally lobbying on behalf of controversial Canadian mining companies. Company, in case of Barrick Gold, when he was there in 2007, a company that had just said it was going to lay off 1,000 striking miners. Harper government's put tens of millions of dollars of Canadian aid money into supporting mining interests, sometimes quite controversial initiatives, where in one instance where they brought a Canadian NGO together with a Canadian mining company to work on the NGO to work in the community where the Canadian mining company is operating, which is really designed to sort of pacify local opposition to the Canadian-owned mine.
What was the Canadian NGO?
Plan Canada.
Plan Canada.
Very well-known NGO. $5.5 million in Canadian aid money devoted in Burkina Faso to Plan Canada's initiative. But really across the continent, the Harper government has been channeling aid money to different mining-related initiatives. They've also been signing foreign investment promotion and protection agreements with different African countries, and these foreign investment promotion and protection agreements provide Canadian mining companies with the ability to sue governments, African governments, for lost profits if a government was to expropriate a mining concession, if it was to bring in domestic procurement rules mandating.
And of course, we have the same laws here in Canada, so they can do it to us too.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, they're also signing these FIPA type agreements with there's a FIPA type thing within NAFTA. But the difference is that, first of all, it's all one-sided. It's only Canadian companies that are going to be potentially suing African countries because there is no investment going the other way. Yeah. Also, unlike NAFTA, this FIPA the FIPAs that they've been signing, and they've signed between 10 and 15 of them with African, or negotiators signed with African governments. They're actually locked in for 16 years. Unlike NAFTA, which actually can be abrogated in about 6 months, the FIPA is effectively locked in for 16 years, meaning that if a democratically elected African government today signs a FIPA, future governments are beholden to that. So if a government wants to, change directions. But even worse in the sort of undemocratic nature of signing these agreements with African countries that the Harper government's been pursuing, in the spring, they signed a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement with the government in Burkina Faso. The government of Burkina Faso was a caretaker government because in October there was a popular revolt against elected government, or against the 27-year Blaise Compaoré regime, and they were supposed to be preparing for elections in October. So basically the Harper government signed a FIPA agreement with the regime in Burkina Faso with no pretense of electoral legitimacy, but it's going to lock in future governments for 16 years. And
so that's what Canada does, and we don't know anything about it. And here we are in the middle of an election, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, but there was a democratic movement in Africa many years ago, and I remember the name Patrice Lumumba. If you can just set the stage and talk a bit about Canada's role in that, and we've just got a short time.
Yeah, so there's a history of Canada playing a role in overthrowing the post-independence progressive African leaders, and no example is more significant than Canada's role in undermining and then assassinating Patrice Lumumba at the end of 1960.
Now, was he what you would call a potentially good leader?
I would say, he only had 3 months in office. He was elected upon independence. Belgians had a very brutal form of colonial rule in the Congo.
So there was some hope.
There was a great deal of hope.
And Canada played a role in...
And Canada played a role through a UN mission. The Lumumba basically turned to the UN when the Belgians supported a secessionist movement in the east of the country and so Lumumba wanted a UN force to protect the territorial integrity.
Right. And they betrayed him.
And the UN force, which Washington used really much to undermine Lumumba, and a Canadian colonel, 1,900 Canadian troops participated, played a very important role in the intelligence gathering, and a Canadian colonel boasted years later that he told Joseph Mobutu, the longtime dictator, where Lumumba was. Mobutu captured Lumumba and he was assassinated a few weeks later. His body dissolved in acid. So Canada played a very important role in this widely seen as a major imperial crime of the post-independence period in Africa.
Yves Engler, thank you very much. And folks, that unfortunately, we've got to deal with the truth. We can do a lot better than this. The corruption at the highest levels of our country is completely out of control. Thanks for watching this segment of Citizen.